afternoon. Are you all full? Whoa, they increased the intensity of that spotlight. So I'm sorry, I apologize to the panelists in advance. You're going to sit up here and feel like you're under interrogation, but it's very, very bright. So I have the pleasure of introducing this afternoon's sessions in a very general way, but specifically of introducing the force of nature, Ms. Christy Lee Brown, who has become primarily responsible for a lot of what you're going to hear this afternoon. Mrs. Brown's new vision of health incorporates science and community advocacy to make all decisions through the lens of health. This new vision inspired the foundation of the Institute for Healthy Air, Water, and Soil in 2012 and the partnership with the University of Louisville that became the Envirome Institute in 2018. I was just telling them at the table that that was our probably our most popular panel last year, was the session on what the Envirome Institute does and their connection of the environment with our health outcomes. That's not the only thing Christy Brown is known for doing. She's had a lot of successes in her life, and as a philanthropist, she has quite diverse interests. She founded as I said, the Envirome Institute at the University of Louisville, which studies that connection between environment and human health. She founded the Center for Interfaith Relations and the first U.S. Festival of Faiths. She supports the National Trust for Historic Preservation and helped designate Louisville as a national treasure. That's very close to my heart. She co-founded the Institute for Healthy Air, Water, and Soil. She provided funding for Louisville's Grows Healthy House, a community space focused on sustainable living. And she's a board member for several other organizations, including the Berry Center, which we're very familiar with, and the Sustainable Food Trust in England, which I have had the opportunity to become familiar with. So without any further ado, I am going to introduce Christy Lee Brown, and she is going to introduce Dr. Aruni Bhatnagar.
Hi, everybody. Oh my gosh, I cannot see you. She's exactly right. It's blinding. But what I did see earlier when I walked in was how incredibly energetic you looked and how young you looked. And since I am of that other generation, it warms my heart and it gives me a tremendous sense of hope that you, the hardworking people of this state, who care deeply about our health in all of its forms, are here giving your time for this conference, but more importantly, giving of your professional career to care for this glorious state. I came here because of love, and I would put money on the fact that you're all here basically because of love. Your job description probably says something else, but there is something that is connected to love that keeps you coming every day to your hard work and to you being so passionate. One of the things that, the reason I was involved in all those things that the secretary mentioned is because of being a parent. And how many of you are parents? Yes, lots of you. It's wonderful. And for those of us who aren't maybe actually parents, we are parents because we care for others. And so it's your caring and your sharing that is what is so important for all of us and for the health of this glorious state. Well, I'm not from here originally. As I said, I came because of falling in love with a Kentuckian when I was 19. That was a long time ago. But basically, I adore your state. For those of you who have been here for many, many generations, I want to say you're very fortunate people to have that historic legacy, because this place is extraordinary, and it really is worth all of your efforts to keep it healthy. Thank you from the nice lady from the steel company who talked about the circular sort of mentality and belief that their company has, because that is what is so crucial. And it's why we have given you on your tables this circle of harmony and health. And if you don't have one, I hope you'll find one. I hope you'll take it home. You don't have to wear it. We'd love you to wear it, but you don't have to. But think about, use it maybe as a tool the way we do, which is basically to help understand, and there it is right behind us, so fun, to help us understand the interconnection of all these different forms of health. And I would suggest that that's what each of you are doing. You may think that you're really only in the environmental world that is catering only to air pollution, but actually I would suggest that you are related to all these different forms of health. You're related to the mental health because our scientists, like Dr. Bhatnagar, who I am here to introduce, so I have to hurry up and just let him have the stage. But he knows, and he's going to tell you about the interconnection between science and between unhealthy air and between your physical health, and also probably even because how it affects your mental health. It's all interconnected, and that's why we actually have given you those circles, which we hope you'll find a useful tool. Now, the secretary was just taking one of these. I hope she doesn't mind me showing. But I said, may I borrow it? Because, you know, I take these. And so we talked about why we take these. Well, we know that we take these in part because of our Kentucky air is nowhere near as healthy as it should be. So that's what you are all about. And thank you for that and for wanting to make each of us much, much healthier, and more importantly, our children and our grandchildren much, much healthier. So it's an honor to welcome we call him Dr. B, so just use that. Welcome wonderful Dr. B, who has given his life through the University of Louisville, through his internationally recognized scientific work to care for all of our forms of health, bringing science in the most important ways to help us understand that. So now you have the real speaker. So thank you for your patience with me. It's an honor to be here with you, and thank you for each of you.
Well, thank you, Christy, very much. You're amazing, and it's just incredible to follow you. It's just a very hard task. And thank you, Secretary Goodman, for the invitation and for everybody of you to be here for this sort of brief overview. We want to talk to you about what we do at the Envirome Institute. It's a collective vision of the people at the University of Louisville and a group of dedicated scientists and scholars and educators who have actually, like Christy was saying, dedicated their lives to this work. And I think it resonates very well with what we're talking about here. We were discussing with Secretary Goodman about how there's a natural affinity about health and the environment, and the work that the Department of Energy and Environment does has more impact on health than actually any other form I can think of, because they actually worry about the environment, which we believe is critical for our health and well-being, because without that, we would not be able to progress. So I wanted to get into my PowerPoint. Yes. So the Envirome Institute was actually founded in 2018 with Christy and Dr. Ted Smith and I. We got together, and we have been at the university for many, many years, studying the effects of air pollution on heart disease and how that affects long-term risk of sort of acute myocardial infarction and other cardiovascular outcomes. So we thought that it is time to actually expand this view and look at environment in a more general sense, not just the environment as a source of pollution and as a source of like chemical exposures, but also as a source of health and well-being. We certainly need a healthy and clean environment for us to live in. And so we came up with the idea of the Envirome. So I'm sure you've all heard of what a genome is. So the Envirome is an analog. It is that part of the environment that is uniquely ours. And that part of it is shaped by our own choices and by our own maybe circumstances. But it is also the one that matters the most for our health and well-being. So we want to then develop this sort of an umbrella to advance an understanding of how environmental factors influence health. And again, we think that environment in a very broad sense, and I'm sure you've seen the circle, that there are different domains of the environment, the economic environment that we live in, the cultural environment, and of course the financial environment, and all of these things do have a great impact on our well-being and profoundly influence our health. And as most of the work in medicine has been focused on just the physical health, we've forgotten how this completeness is so critical. And so that's what we're trying to understand. And so we will create new knowledge of understanding environment in a radically different way and its interconnectedness. So parts of our system that our institute supports are different centers. And one of the centers that we support is the American Heart Association Regulatory Science Center, which is a center dedicated to understanding the impact of tobacco and tobacco use on heart disease. We've done a lot of work on looking at, say, regular tobacco products, vaping products, and neonicotine products. And we've set forth sort of national policy guidance and scientific position papers to be able to understand what this impact of this new wave of tobacco products are going to have. And this is actually a very large center, over 12 different institutions across the country. And we've been doing this for the last 13 years in trying to set the tone of what tobacco regulation in this country is likely to be. The other center that we have is called the Center for Cardiometabolic Science, and we in Kentucky have the highest burden of what we call cardiometabolic disease. And you may know about it as heart disease or as liver disease. We have the highest burden of these diseases in our state, or maybe close to the highest. And so we need to understand what are the forces that drive this sort of disease risk. So what can we do about that? And so part of the studies that we are conducting in our group is to look at how exercise affects your levels of inflammation and how inflammation is turned off. It also sort of looks at how exercise can alter the metabolism of, say, your muscle and your heart, and so that we will be able to develop more personalized, more effective protocols and regimens to be able to, at least in small measure, attenuate the high burden of cardiometabolic disease that we have in the state. We also are looking at maternal health. We have one of the highest levels of maternal mortality in our state, and we're trying to look at what happens to the mother. You know, there's a lot of work on looking at fetal development, the effect of exposures on fetus, and so on, but relatively less work on what happens to mother's health, not only with the time that she's pregnant, but also after birth. Few people know that during pregnancy, women's heart actually doubles in size. And then after birth, the heart needs to contract back and go to its original shape. And sometimes it doesn't go back completely. And so there is continuous risk. Almost every major organ in the body of the mother gets remodeled during pregnancy. And there are cells that are gained, and so there is a great need to understand how that we can understand the health of the mother and how sort of subsequent pregnancies could be made healthier. So we have a whole program looking into that. Also, studying the effects of exposure, for example, forever chemicals, plastics, what do they do not only to the mother but also to the offspring? And some of the interesting things we are finding, that mothers who are exposed to high levels of forever chemicals or PFAS, their children, when they grow up to be teenagers, have sleep disturbances, very, very profound sleep disturbances, something that we didn't anticipate. So there are these effects that we are discovering that might be critical, not only trying to figure out the general mechanisms of how these things are affecting the health, but also what can we do to attenuate these risks and how to identify these risks in community. We also have a very thriving, what we call the Superfund program, which is to look at all the Superfund sites. We have quite a few Superfund sites in Kentucky. Many of them have been closed and supposedly remedied, or there have been some remediation of those sites, and we need to keep an eye on that. But there are some of them are still sort of managed to be a source of pollution, and so we are sort of funded by the National Institutes of Health to be able to at least gauge the risks of these Superfund sites across the state and what type of emissions they might have, and how can we actually attenuate these emissions and what disease risks they may pose to people who live around these sites. And so one of the class of chemicals that we've been focused on are called the volatile organic compounds, and these are things like benzene, xylene, and toluene, and all these different types of chemicals that are generated in the air, which are very large amounts, particularly in our local air. When I moved to Louisville about 20 years ago, we had one of the worst airs in the country. We had high levels of iron chloride and butadiene, which was about like 200-fold higher than the EPA standards. But since then, we have made a lot of progress. We've cleaned up our air. We've made deliberate attempts to be able to contain these exposures and to prevent all these, what we call in Louisville, the rubber town emissions from getting into communities. And we are still trying to understand how to do that better. But Superfund sites are a very sort of rich source of VOCs, and we are trying to understand, A, what levels these emissions are, B, what can we do to attenuate the limitations, and C, what is the actual disease risk. So we were looking, for example, mapping hotspots of VOC exposures in Louisville, and not surprisingly, we see it near Lee's Lane, we see it near Rubber Town. These are the sites that have traditionally been parts of rubber manufacturing in Louisville, and so we still have a burden, so a lot of work still left for us to do. And we look forward to partnering more with the Energy Commission here, the people in this room, how to do this. And it's not only a sort of a steady, constant threat, but also sometimes we do have really bad sort of adverse events. I remember there were many trail derailments when we had a big butadiene leak in Louisville. So we need to figure out what to do, how to measure it, how to contain it, and be prepared for such eventualities. So that's part of our mission, is to be able to not only do work in the lab that is of great academic interest, which of course is our main focus, but also to do things that make a real difference in the real world. And so we also have institute, and you heard about that, is the Center for Healthy Air, Water, and Soil. And in this, we have been at the forefront of looking at how can we use wastewater sampling to be able to estimate disease risk and now environmental pollutant exposures. So we have been working on this idea since the beginning of COVID. And when COVID hit, we said, oh, everybody wanted to do wastewater monitoring, but we had sort of been developing the technology to do that. And during COVID, I think we mapped out and sort of surveyed almost all the prisons in Kentucky, many schools, and certainly the Jefferson County, where we did provide almost weekly updates for almost 4 years to look at the level of contamination and COVID threat around town. And so that was one of the most unique programs in the country, because we could do sort of random sampling of different places and get to true rates of transmission of the disease, rather than to be able to look at some sort of a convenience sampling. And we have been following the levels of COVID through all this time, and you can see this approach has been very useful because it sort of aligns well with the incidence of COVID as it was ebbing up and down within a city. So it provides a very useful tool, and now we need to get a little bit more sort of sophisticated with this approach, with not just looking at COVID. We can look at flu, we can look at influenza, we can look at other chronic diseases, but also we can look at environmental pollutants and see are there areas that have high levels of pollution, whether they would be the VOCs, the metabolites of VOCs, or whether they're metals. We are also trying to see if we can predict disease risk. There's some hot spots where people have, say, high levels of colon cancer, and where other places there may be high risk of heart disease. And so are there these sort of different types of risks that are geographically distributed that we need to identify and then selectively target? So that's kind of the things that we continue to do. And this also would be very useful in terms of any sort of emergency response to any events that we might have, to look at the level of contamination and the persistence of contamination. One of the questions that I was asked repeatedly when there was a butadiene spill in Louisville is, when can we go back home? Because people in the neighborhood were actually made to evacuate. And so we have really no standard of how to measure contamination throughout the neighborhood. We can't just go sample 1 or 2 houses. And how are we going to do this in a large geographic space and tell people, yes, this is unsafe and this is safe? So we need to develop all those approaches to be able to effectively contribute to disaster management. We also are looking at our rivers, and particularly the Ohio River Valley, where we are trying to work out how can we make the river healthier, what are the different ways and approaches that we have. We have an enormously rich resource, one of the best sort of waterways that anywhere in the world, and then but it is contaminated. I was reading somewhere that Kentucky is like second or third state with the most fresh water in the country, but apparently 95% of our fresh water is contaminated because of a legacy of mining and mercury poisoning and so on. So we need to be very, very cognizant and be good heirs and stewards of this legacy that we have. And I think we are trying to be a sort of a partner in that initiative as well. And I think last week we had a great assembly of all the people working on the Ohio Riverway, and to be able to develop a sort of a combined, effective, unified approach to preserve this asset and to make it more useful and healthy. The Institute also supports what we call the Urban Design Studio, because essentially in Louisville, we are part of an urban environment. And this is a sort of place where we are working on to increase education and outreach and advocacy of the place. We also create our placemaking and community engagement so that we are sort of part of our social fabric, particularly our urban fabric that we are all part of. And so that we can do research in how to make urban environments more and more livable. About 60% or more than 65% of human population is now going to be living in cities, and the cities have their own what we call metabolism, and it has its own energy demands and its own waste and excretion. So it is almost like a living organism, and so we need to understand how to think holistically about the city and what we can do to make it better. So we can explore the link between what are parts of the city, what are features of the built environment that have actually an impact on health. And I've been part of several panels in trying to develop the American Heart Association policy of the impact of built environment on heart disease risk and in chronic disease risk as a whole. This is sort of an underdeveloped area that we need to explore more. But I also want to talk to you about some of the major projects that we do. And this is one of the projects I think Dr. Smith talked about last year at this meeting. But I wanted to sort of bring it up again because we're making progress. We call it the Green Heart Project. And the project is actually in South Louisville between the airport and Churchill Downs. And what we did there was to plant very large trees to see if planting trees would clean up the air in a neighborhood and thereby promote health and well-being of people living there. So what we did is a kind of what we call a clinical trial. We have a control group in which we didn't plant any trees. We have a target group where we planted trees, and we now compare whether the planting trees will make any difference. There have been lots of studies showing that people who live in green environments are healthier, and they have lived longer lives. They have lower risk of mental health problems, lower risks of anxiety, depression, even lower rates of suicide. There have been studies showing that green spaces decrease crime rates. And so, but there are a lot of factors that vary with greenness. People who live in green areas are healthier, they have better medical care and so on. So we wanted to say, if we just take the same place and put trees in it, would that make a difference? So it's an approach that we use in medicine all the time. It's called a clinical trial. Instead of giving a drug to people, we're giving trees. And since we could not plant small trees, it'll take 30 years for them to grow, we planted very large trees, and some are like 20, 30-foot trees, and we planted almost 8,000 trees in this area now. And every year we have in-person exams of 500 to 700 people to see how their disease risk is being attenuated over the years because of the increased greenness in the neighborhood. And we got some exciting results. We announced last year there was a lot of national attention. We got papers from the Washington Post, the NPR, we got the Today Show, and everybody's very excited about this could be a new model of how to have healthier living environments. We planted trees next to roadways to be able to see how that will attenuate the effects of pollution. And so we started with something like this, and then we end up with something like that. So when you have this much greenery, you can attenuate the flow of pollution from the freeway into the neighborhood. And we've been fortunate enough to be asked by the people making the Kentucky group, which is working with the Brent Spence Bridge, to be able to use the lessons learned from the Green Heart Project to be able to develop a green corridor to the bridge so that we can attenuate noise and pollution spewing out from the freeway into the neighborhoods of the people who live there. More importantly, also, maybe we can make the drive up to that area more pleasant so that people are less distracted. There are actually studies that a certain geometry of trees and their sort of the fractal configuration can actually improve alertness and decrease accidents on a road. So we're trying to develop those ideas that we have learned from the Green Heart Project into that. But also internationally, I was invited last year to talk at the General Assembly of the United Nations to be able to provide guidance of how we will develop biodiversity and greenness in urban environments so that we in Kentucky could be models and examples of creating healthier, greener environments of the future. To actually do this in a smaller scale would be also critical because the Green Heart Project was a very, very difficult project to do and a very expensive project. It's still going on. We've been funded by the Nature Conservancy and National Institutes of Health, and I think to date we must have spent over $25 million in trying to get this real grand experiment going. But then we can test our ideas in a smaller scales, and this is one idea in which we are looking at, is to look at the effects of greenness in attenuating urban heat. And in Louisville, we have one of the worst heat island effects in the country, which is the central part of the town heats up and cools very slowly compared to the suburbs. And so we thought, if you put little dense plantings in the middle of the town, would that make a difference and attenuate the heat in the area? So we came up with this idea of planting microforest. And this is a project that we undertook. This is between the 5th and Ali in downtown Louisville. That used to be called the Founder Square. It used to be a relatively unabandoned, or it was an abandoned park, needed some love, care, and affection. So we went there. The city was very gracious and gave us a 30-year lease to do that. We created a round plinth, or we call it a sort of a planting area. And then on this area, we did a variety of studies for 2 years looking at what is the temperature, what is the humidity, what is the pollution level, how do people feel about walking there. We have people, all sort of instrumented who would go walk, and we look at their heart rate and blood pressure and stress levels and so on. And we have them do this in this area as well as in the parking lot. But we created this space, and then we planted over 200 trees in this area. It's only 0.6 acres. And so this is what it's called now. It's called the Traeger Microforest. If you're ever in downtown Louisville, I sort of invite you to come and visit to see how a small urban planting could make a difference. We have all sorts of equipment around it, as you can see somewhere in the middle, to be able to gather really important data, not only about temperature and heat and humidity, but also about biodiversity, avian biodiversity, soil, microbial biodiversity, and to be able to calculate sort of carbon fluxes, to be able to look at how soil conditions are improved by these dense plantings. And again, I think if we succeed in this, and we have to some level, we can use this as a model around the world to create healthier environments, to be able to attenuate some of the adverse effects of intense urbanization and intense energy use. We've also now started looking at the whole downtown as such, and this is a new sort of initiative that we started. It's called the Green Print Project, and we just signed a charter with all the people who are actually greening things in downtown Louisville to be able to work together, collectively share resources, and reimagine downtown Louisville to be able to plant trees. Everybody has been planting trees, and everybody loves things to be greener. But what is more critical is that needs to be a baseline evaluation. You need to plant trees where they're needed most. So we want to develop some baseline data of downtown Louisville. Where is the heat? Where is the temperature? Where is the pollution? Where is the noise? Where is the traffic? Where are the people? And once we know all of that, then we judicially plant the right type of trees with the right height, density, and configuration to be able to maximize the benefits that could accrue from having much greener environments. We're going to look at how we can improve the quality of the air in the area, how can we lower the amounts of heat there, and then we can look at how we bring people together. Because like Christy was pointing out, it's not about one thing or the other. We need to be able to develop all these aspects. So these places are not only places where we can have green trees or we can have lower heat, but also they could be cultural spaces, they could be spiritual spaces, they could be spaces where people bring their families. I was there a few weeks ago at the Traeger Microforest. There were people there before their wedding. They were shooting prenuptial photographs into the forest because they thought it was a nice place to have a backdrop for somebody before their wedding to shoot pictures in. That's the type of interaction we want with the community, invite them in, and to be able to partner with them to create this sort of healthy spaces all around downtown. We're going to look at the entire downtown to be able to bring everybody together, create a coalition so everybody knows what they are doing. There are at least 8 or 10 major projects going on in downtown. There are parks, there are waterways, there are restructuring of the roadways. We need to be sort of coordinating all of that. For example, if you're going to plant a whole range of trees in this park, we have to make sure that your palette is diverse and we're not duplicating, not everybody's planting oaks and maples all over town, but that we have some sort of a semblance of biodiversity. So we think that if we can coordinate all of that, we would get more out of the resources that we're committing. So the overall idea then is to be able to create healthier cities in the future and to develop new models of healthy living to decrease the risk of chronic diseases that so burden us and so plague us now in Kentucky and elsewhere, that maybe doing these things may be of some benefit in contrast to all the drugs and the medicines that we've been working on. So finally, the new initiative that we have is we call the New Vision of Health Campus, and this is a new facility that we are creating in downtown Louisville, and it is actually a tiered building. As you can see, these things are reminiscent of Kentucky bluffs and echo the ecology of our cliffs in Kentucky, with sort of plantings at each area, so that will be something really remarkable and unique in the middle of the town. This is a rendering of what it would look like. It is between just opposite the Sealback Hotel, if you know that. All of this is to be able to develop a new understanding of health. I've been involved in medical research for a very, very long time, and all of our interest and focus has been on treating disease, preventing disease. We've been so obsessed with all of that, but we never cared about health. But I think caring about health is equally critical, because if you improve health, you simultaneously or concurrently increase your resilience and decrease the risk of disease. So rather than passively trying to prevent disease, we want to actively promote health. And that's the idea behind it. We don't even know what health is, how it could be measured, and what can we do about it. But we do know that some things contribute to health. And that's what we're going to focus on. There are 4 areas we think are particularly critical for health: physical activity, nutrition, sleep, and stress. And so you want to create facilities that would actually enable us to do studies in these areas. You'll be surprised how little state-of-the-art work there is in these areas. Everybody understands how critical they are. But more importantly, not only that individually how physical activity and nutrition and sleep can help, but also how they relate to each other, what we call edge effects. How is sleep affected by nutrition? How does stress leads to changes in physical activity? How does sleep affect physical activity, and so on? So we want to study these edge effects to be able to develop a complete picture of how we can best promote health. And I think that's what's critically most needed in Kentucky now, is to be able to create new models of healthy living rather than simply talking about disease prevention, bad choices, and people who don't exercise and so on. We need to find a better way, and that's what we are setting out to do. So I'm going to leave you with some of these images for this new facility that we are very excited about. I think this will transform the downtown and will create an environment that's conducive to not only scholarship and learning, but also for community interaction, to people who come to our city and to our state and think this is something important, interesting, and valuable is happening here. And we look forward to your partnership. I think we can look at the whole initiative on clean air and clean water, and I think all the facilities that we are creating as an infrastructure would be really one of the sort of resources that we can make available, and certainly a partnership to be able to work collectively as Team Kentucky to address our local problems locally. So I'm going to stop here and thank you again for being here, and thank you for listening.